Hello, welcome and a very good evening. And tonight we want to take a look at the WP32 McCake, and that is quite a mouthful. So the question is, what is this thing? Down here you see my slightly beat up Roland MT-32. This is my backup unit. I have one attached to the 486 PC, which I'm using for playing games. And if you don't know what it is, this massive beast here is basically an external sound card MIDI device that Sierra and LucasArts and a lot of other companies supported back in the late 80s to get some very decent sounding synthesized music into their games. And some people would argue that it's the best way to play titles such as Monkey Island 2 or Space Quest series or King's Quest with sound and music. And later they would switch to CD-based audio, but back then space was at a premium, so MIDI files were pretty compact and could be used to produce sound, and the AdLib and SoundBlaster cards were slowly arriving, but they had some very electronic sounding instruments, I would say, while the Roland were more high-end. There are of course keyboards and synthesizers made by Roland, which sound pretty decent, and this could produce very nice music. It could be programmed to have custom patch sets, custom instruments basically. But these devices have become quite a bit rare nowadays. They were introduced in 1987, so they are now 35 years old at the tops, and maybe 30 years for the later models. And you can get them still for 250 to 350 euros, which is pretty expensive. I mean, back in the day you would have paid basically the same thing, something like $600 or probably 800, 900 German marks or something. Not quite sure here. So yeah, they basically didn't lose any value over the years. In maybe the 2000s, early 2000s, you could get them pretty cheap because nobody wanted them. But now they've become kind of a collectible. As I said, this device here is a bit beat up. It was used by a musician, so the case is a little bit, has holes on the side because it was rack mounted. So I'm putting it up here for show, or if my other one breaks I can use it for parts. And in comes the McCake. And this is based on the MT32 Pi project, which is an MT32 emulator based on the Raspberry Pi. It uses the popular MUNT MT32 emulator, which people might have heard of if you have played Lucasfilm or Sierra games using this CumVM software, because it also has MUNT MT32 emulation built in, which sounds pretty close to the original, and we will have a listen and a comparison later on. So this thing here is a so-called Waveblaster module. That is, if you have a sound card with a Waveblaster header, everything from the SoundBlaster 16 onwards did have that, and many of the modern homebrew cards also have that. You can plug it onto that card, supply power via this floppy style power connector, and it contains a small Raspberry Pi compute module on here, so you don't need an extra Raspberry Pi for that. This is basically a stripped down Pi without video output, just the CPU and RAM, more or less. And it also has this little display which reflects everything that the MT32 would display here. Yeah, so that is pretty neat. And yeah, we can take it out of this bag, plug it onto my PC MIDI card, which has a Waveblaster header. And in theory, you can also put the display on a cable into your front of the PC case. You can see the messages that are running on here, because of course if it's on the sound card you can't see it. So let's open up the 486, take out the MIDI card, install this thing, and then we can have a listen and we can compare to the real deal and see if it's actually the same or even better.
Right, so I took out the PC MIDI card, which is this thing. I already did a video on this one, and I'll link to it up here or something, and also maybe in the video description. And it's basically a clone of a MIDI card from the 1980s, done by Keropi, aka Leo Dallas. And it usually comes without this thing attached here, because this is another thing. The McCake is produced by Sadako. I will also link to his shop in the video description. And he also makes this thing here. This one is the X2, a general MIDI or even GS, I'm not sure, I think it might be GS compatible, but definitely general MIDI compatible Waveblaster thing based on the Dream chipset. This is basically the synth, and it's pretty nice and small. You can even attach headphones to it, and some, I think this is for programming or flashing, not sure, maybe also for power if you use it standalone. Not quite sure. Yeah, but it's pretty nice if you want to have MIDI compatibility. However, a lot of games from the 80s will sound absolutely horribly wrong if you select MIDI output and they expect an MT32 actually. So for example, Monkey Island 2 or some of the Sierra games will sound very weird with this thing installed. So what we'll do instead is take out the McCake and install that instead. First things first, let's have a look. So there are quite a bunch of buttons here, which are usually also found on the MT32. These, of course, will not be available to you without some kind of wiring going to the front of the card, basically. I think this here might be the header for exactly that same thing, B1, B2, B3, B4. And maybe even an encoder wheel for the volume, I guess. So you can take everything from here to the front of the PC. There is, I think, a card with the MUNT emulator already on there. It can also emulate different other kinds of synthesizers. Let's see if we can make that work as well and compare that, let's say, to my ST55 sound canvas. But yeah, we'll see. This thing on top here, that's the Raspberry Pi compute module with a big Broadcom chip. And I think this is probably the RAM module, I would guess. And it's stuck on there with two big connectors. And the whole thing here is actually pretty thick, so I'm not sure that we can put it in like this, because the slot might not be wide enough. So I might have to remove one of the other sound cards, which isn't a big problem, because I have a lot of cards in the 486 at the moment, and most people won't have this many cards. And you can always try to use the outermost slot for this monster of a card then. Okay, so let's plug it in, fire up the old DOS machine and run, let's say, Monkey Island 2 and some other games.
First of all, we will try to see if we can discern between the MT32 and the McCake. So here is Monkey Island 2, and I will switch back and forth between both devices, and let's have a listen. I must say I did not hear a lot of differences. I think the McCake has a little bit more treble and higher frequencies, which might be due to the fact that perhaps the MT32 has some kind of low-pass filter in its audio circuitry. So I took the two captures and loaded them up in Audacity and took a spectrogram, and at the top you see the McCake and at the bottom the MT32. And I think you can see a little bit, maybe some higher frequencies, but it's really very, very tiny differences. The emulation seems to be pretty accurate. I definitely have trouble hearing any differences. So this is at least one very good positive result already for the McCake. However, all is not well in the land of the McCake. When I tried out Lume, which is running here in the background, the Roland MT32 actually sounds fine. Everything is good with the MT32 patch, which is an optional fourth disc, I think, that Lucasfilm provided. And we can have a listen now, and after that I will play a short sequence what it sounds on the McCake like, and it was a not very pleasant surprise, let me tell you. But this here is now Roland MT32 original hardware with the Overture. Yeah, honestly, I can't take that for much longer, so here's the Roland MT32 back. Something is broken there, definitely, but it might just be a problem with Lume in and of itself, because sometimes even with original hardware, as we will see later, you can have problems. But there are many more games, of course, especially the Sierra adventure titles from the late 80s and early 90s were very good in supporting the MT32, so let's now have a listen to a couple of those titles. Space Quest 3 making the first appearance here. The Roland MT32 was supported by so many games. King's Quest V here is probably one of the other prime examples, the first Sierra game to use 256 colors, or at least properly, with some other games like Zeliard maybe coming first, but that's not the topic of today. It's the MT32 and the McCake. So I think you have a huge variety of games that work with the MT32, and it's not only Sierra, like here with Sylphid, but so many other adventure titles, strategy games, role-playing games, the Ultima series, etc, etc. Too many to name actually. The MT32 was really a standard for gaming and sound, basically. One game where I encountered a problem with the original MT32 actually was Day of the Tentacle by LucasArts. And the intro is rolling here in the background, but at some point the whole MT32 was hanging all the time. That might be due to the fact that this was very late in the MT32's lifetime, 1993, and I actually have an old MT32 with old firmware, so I probably have a problem there with the hardware, and maybe newer revisions won't have that, so let's have a listen here. Yeah, and there it hangs and you just get this annoying buzzing sound. The McCake, on the other hand, just works fine. Let's have a listen again. But the McCake has one more trick up its sleeve. It can also emulate any General MIDI or GS standard synthesizer by using a SoundFont, and you can actually switch this via the config file and or the buttons on the PCB. So here is again Day of the Tentacle, but this time with GS support or General MIDI support. And yeah, it sounds actually pretty decent with the supplied 32 megabyte SoundFont, and you can put other SoundFonts on there as well. And of course, once you have General MIDI and GS support, you can also run other applications. For example, Windows is a very prime example with lots of apps. And of course, the Canyon Mid is one of our favorites. So here is the same setup with the GS compatibility, SoundFont, playing Canyon Mid. Have a short listen. If you want to have a McCake of your own, it is being sold by Serda Shop. I will link to it in the video description. I have no affiliations other than I sometimes email with the owner and the designers of the sound cards, but I don't get any kickbacks. The cheapest version is around 55 euros without the Pi Compute module. You can add a fully assembled version for 114 euros. This is what I basically have, but I did have a pre-release more or less. And you can also buy extra 3.5 inch or 5¼ inch panels so that you can control the McCake from the outside of your PC, but this is strictly optional. So that was the WP32 McCake, the Roland MT32 compatible wavetable synthesizer, which fits on old or oldish wavetable header equipped sound cards, and it's a very good alternative to buying the real MT32. Plus, you can also emulate any SoundFont based General MIDI synthesizer, even GS standard, which is pretty nice. And in the meantime, I also found out that this button here lets you switch between MT32 and SoundFont based synthesis, which is nice, so you don't need to reconfigure the SD card. The SD card just says in which mode this whole thing boots up. And you can also switch sound banks or MT32 ROMs, because there are different versions. I think 2 or 3 different ones that you can try out. And you can adjust the volume. The OLED is a nice touch, but it's actually not very useful inside of the machine, which is why Cerakote sells these things with a little 3.5-inch header to be mounted in the front of your PC, which has like an extension cable with the OLED and the buttons which come out of this header here, which is not populated on my copy. But you can just simply plug this in as is and it will work. Yeah, the price is definitely much lower than a used old MT32. Of course, the original machine is pretty nice, but most of us won't be able to buy something like that, and it might also be a bit too expensive. So all in all, I would say this is really good because you only need one device for general MIDI, GS and MT32 compatibility. There are maybe a few games that won't work perfectly, depending on your setup, but I think this will do in most of the cases, and maybe there will be patches or something to fix that. The firmware gets enhanced, and as you've seen, even with an original MT32 it can happen that the device hangs depending on the firmware and the game that you're playing. So nothing is perfect, and I think this is currently the best thing that you can buy if you want MT32 compatibility and you have a Waveblaster header on your sound card. If you don't, there are alternatives that just have MIDI DIN sockets, and you can basically have an external Raspberry Pi with this whole interface and this software. It's also an option, but this doesn't take up any desk space basically, and it fits inside of your machine. The only thing is, with the LED panel installed and the power header here, space is actually pretty tight, so I couldn't get another expansion card right in front of that. There was not enough space there, so I had to leave a gap. So basically this is almost like having two cards in the system instead of one, depending on your layout of your PC, but you might be able to use the rightmost slot so that there is not a problem there. Yeah, but it definitely is a very nice solution. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you share, like and subscribe. If you want to, you can support me on Patreon or Ko-Fi. And otherwise, I just hope to see you in the next video. So goodbye.